Afternoon and welcome. I'm David Smith from the Forge Center for Peace Building and Humanitarian Education. We're based in Washington, D.C., and we are a 501c3 entity that focuses on humanitarian education training and practices. Normally about this time of the year, we would be preparing for a live 4-day experiential-based training in Western Maryland, which is what we've been known for the many years we've operated, training graduate students and professionals on how to be humanitarian workers. We are not doing that this year because of the nature of the pandemic. We have been operating in the last year in a virtual setting. So all of our programming right now is virtually. And what we've been doing on a monthly basis is holding Forge Center conversations, looking at particular topics that are of interest to our staff, our alum, things that we're thinking that is going on in the field. So what we are doing today is our October Forge Center conversation, and this will go on for about an hour. I'm in a minute going to introduce our two guests and really be asking them questions in the next hour, but also leaving space and time for you all to ask questions of them about the work that they do. At the end, I want to make sure that you understand the relationship between humanitarian work and we'll say the social and political change work within the context of civilian accompaniment work, which is what both Heather and Eli really focus on in the work that they are doing. I want to also acknowledge that we are being co-sponsored today by the Center for International Studies at St. Cloud State University in Minnesota, of which we are very grateful. And we have Amy Kalmus, who's joining us, who's an American Sign Language interpreter. So she's going to be working with some of our students and participants today. So we are so very grateful that she is here. We have not had an interpreter at a session before, but it is something that we're cognizant is very important. We want to enfranchise everyone to participate in this space where we can. So let me start off by telling you a little bit about Eli and Heather, and then we are going to go right into questions. I'm being supported today by Catherine Kozar, who is the administrative assistant. So Catherine and I are going to be managing the chat box, the hand raising. At a certain point, we may open it up for you all to just add your questions. But for the first part, it'll be me asking Eli and Heather questions. So first, I want to introduce Heather Payne. Heather is a conflict resolution and peace building practitioner. She is a former program manager and nonviolent peace force, and she worked in South Sudan. Before South Sudan in that work, she worked in Lebanon with a local civilian society NGO and educational vocational projects for children and women. She has facilitated numerous trainings in different contexts on civilian protection, such as community protection, gender-based violence protection, child protection, and EWER, and I'm sure Heather will tell us what that is. She is working in the United States supporting various unarmed civilian protection structures. And I know she's working with Eli McCarthy, so they'll be able to talk about their relationships. Heather also, I must have to add this, she's an alum of a Forge Center program. She participated in our Atlantic Hope program when we were operating in Florida several years ago. And I'm also proud to say that Heather's a former student of mine at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. So Heather, I'm so glad that you're here. Heather is joining us today from Tulsa. Eli McCarthy, Dr. McCarthy is a colleague of mine. He is the co-founder of DC Peace Team, which offers training in nonviolent communication, restorative justice, bystander intervention, as well as unarmed civilian protection deployments. He teaches at Georgetown University, is where I got to know Eli, in Justice and Peace Studies. His most recent book is entitled A Just Peace Ethic Primer, Building Sustainable Peace and Breaking Cycles of Violence, which he actually just published this year in 2020. So congratulations, Eli, on your book. So what I want to start off is, I'm just going to start off by kind of creating some space and asking both Eli, I'll start off with Heather, asking you both about the work that you have been doing or have been doing, and if you can tell us a little bit about that. So Heather, if you can just share with us about the work of Nonviolent Peace Force and the work that you were doing in South Sudan, talking a little bit about that. Then I'm going to turn it to Eli and ask Eli to talk about DC Peace Teams, and then we'll go into more granular questions, so to speak.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you, David, for the nice introduction. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm also really happy to be here talking about humanitarian work, and also unarmed civilian protection is a passion of mine, so I'm really happy to be here. So what I was doing in South Sudan with Nonviolent Peace Force, this is how I started my unarmed civilian protection work. And Nonviolent Peace Force, they do unarmed civilian protection, or what they call UCP.
Yes.
And,
go ahead, Heather. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so we were working in South Sudan. MP also works in Myanmar, Iraq, the Philippines, and also have recently started doing some different UCP initiatives in the United States, so unarmed civilian protection initiatives in the US. And what we're doing is working with local civilians and teaching them and training them how to be local peace builders and how to resolve conflict, and especially violent conflict, in peaceful ways. And we are working with women, with youth, and with children, and and also advocating on their behalf and teaching them advocation strategies as well. You're on mute. You're on mute, David.
Yeah, how long were you working in South Sudan?
Oh, so I was working there for 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I had 3 different positions. I started off as a protection officer, and then a team leader, and then finally a program manager.
Okay, great. How long have you been back then in the States?
I got back in May,
Okay.
May 2020.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Do you miss being in South Sudan?
A part of me does miss South Sudan. I mean, I really miss the people I was working with, especially my South Sudanese colleagues. I'm still in touch with them pretty much on a weekly basis. We either send each other WhatsApp messages or Skype messages, or whatever. I like to check on them frequently, and they're always asking me, like, how are you doing? And then, they're always trying to get me to come back. They're like, just come back to South Sudan. We miss you. So yeah.
It's nice to be wanted.
Yeah.
So Eli, tell us about DC Peace Team and your work.
Thanks so much, David. It's wonderful to be with you and Heather and this community. It's a very important time and kind of exciting time. I kind of got into this work because I had my own experiences of conflict and struggle as a youngster. The family where there was a lot of conflict, eventually divorce, and raised questions for me about, like, how do we do this well, right? And how do you have healthy relationships and even love? What does that look like? So, the DC Peace Team got started around 2010, and it grew out of some experience I had in grad school, where I was studying peace studies at UC Berkeley and theology and so forth. And I was learning for the first time about groups like the Nonviolent Peace Force and Peace Brigades International and Cure Violence and Christian Peacemaker Teams. And I was like, wow, I had no idea this existed. And what could this sort of look like in the US, in our own communities, and how might that impact kind of the way we imagine conflict in other places and how to deal with it? So the DC Peace Team, our kind of focus is really on cultivating habits and skills of nonviolence in our daily life. And through those habits, our communities can become increasingly nonviolent and resistant to injustice. So, there's a lot of, many of us have our own interpersonal conflict or anxieties, and there's a lot of situations where we might be bystanders due to harassment or the wearing of masks these days, or politics. And there's even energy around alternative community protection in our community. So we're trying to kind of respond to that. Now we do kind of three main things. One is the skill training that David mentioned earlier on nonviolent communication, which is like interpersonal conflict, bystander intervention, where you're a third party to a situation of danger or harassment, restorative justice circles, and unarmed civilian protection. So we've done these, when we did them in person, we did them in New York and Texas, and even as far as China.
Wow. Are you working actively now in spots around the United States?
Yeah, so the second main thing we do is deploy unarmed civilian protection teams. And these can be to like neighborhood situations. So like in DC, we had that gallery place is a place where youth would sometimes get into little fights, but would also be harassing the youth. So we were there to kind of monitor and try to prevent. We also had a safe passage program, which was like kids who were trying to walk to school after there had been some shootings in the neighborhood. So there were adults from that community that would kind of walk this 2-mile radius in the morning and the afternoon to try to keep them safer and feel like more part of the community. And then, regularly we're at political demonstrations, so particularly when there's like a counter protest. So at the 2016 demonstration with Republican National Convention, there are a lot of counter protests. In DC, the Unite the Right rally a couple years ago in DC, the Black Lives Matter marches, March for Life happens every year, has a counter protest. So we do those pretty regularly. We also have a program in Missouri where we're accompanying a Black woman who's running for Congress.
Wow.
She's been facing a lot of threats and threats. So we have a team that's been with her 24 hours to try to protection.
Eli, what's the premise behind civilian accompaniment? That is, as academics, we think about the theory of practice in a sense, right? What is the theory behind it? By what you're doing, what are you doing to make something happen or not happen?
Yeah, well, I think one of the premises is that to the degree we can illuminate the dignity of all people, particularly people who are at risk or who are potentially vulnerable to harm, that can stimulate a kind of energy that shifts the conditions where people are less likely to harm and to dehumanize and then to harm and use violence.
So this is humanizing people, right? I mean, we're looking at humanitarian work. I mean, Heather, when you were in South Sudan, did you find this kind of humanizing people was a really important part of what you were doing?
Yes, yeah, for sure. And as Eli was saying, with this focus on dignity and building relationships with people, because the work would not have been as successful if you don't have really strong relationships with people. And that's, people anywhere from civilians to different local authorities. So yeah, I mean, I think that with this focus, you can get really far in your work and rehumanizing, especially in South Sudan, because, there's different sides. And so everyone is blaming the other side.
Right.
And, depending on where you work, so.
For those in our audience who don't know what's going on in South Sudan, can you give us a little bit of, I mean, not maybe going too deep into the weeds, but kind of an overview?
Yep. So now I think it's been a 2-year signed peace agreement. I think it's 2 years now, or is it a year? I can't remember now. But they were in a civil war, and it was between the government and opposition, and they were in a civil war. And now they're recovering from that. So they're transitioning into from an emergency state to a more development state at the moment. But there's still a lot of internal issues that are going on, either with trying to figure out how to incorporate the opposition back in with the government. There's a lot of tribal conflicts as well.
Yeah, Heather, you froze there. All right. I'll go to Eli
Okay.
until I get Heather back. Oh, there. Heather, are you back?
Yes.
You froze there what you were saying about what you were doing. I'm sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's okay. Sorry. I'm not sure what's up with my Wi-Fi, but so yeah, I'm not sure what you heard either, but there's also intertribal conflict, and there's also a cattle keeper and farmer conflict. So there's a lot of different internal issues as well, and it does require this rehumanization aspect that Eli was talking about.
Do you remember what I always like to hear stories of things, and once again, some of the stories may be kind of difficult. And I'm asking Eli the same question. Situations where you really felt like the humanizing of people was really critical. Heather, and then Eli, if you've got any kind of anecdotal stories kind of thing.
Yeah, I think there were several. I mean, oh gosh, I have a lot of stories actually, but I can maybe think of one that's a bit more obvious, like if we're trying to facilitate a dialogue. So
Mhm.
sometimes we would facilitate dialogues between between cattle keepers and farmers.
Okay.
Sometimes the cattle would come eat all their crops, and then there would be like this huge conflict, and then the farmers would go attack them, and then it just kept coming back and forth. And they needed a third party to come in and give them this space of figuring out what the real issue, getting down to the real issue, and talking about it.
Mm-hmm.
In South Sudan, I found this particularly, instead of them saying like, oh, those farmers, or always saying the different tribe name, oh, this tribe, this, they always do this, or this tribe always does this. So bringing them together, and also the South Sudanese people are very open to dialogue and wanting to sit down and talk with each other and hear each other's side of the story. So yeah, there were like a few times where we had this dialogue between cattle keepers and farmers, and would sit with them, and they were able to discuss and talk things out, and they have their chiefs involved, and the community leaders
Yeah.
involved. And
Let me ask you one other question before I go to Eli. As a woman in that circumstance, right? In a society, and I'm not going to draw any generalizations about the society, so you can share maybe your thoughts, but what was it like being a woman working in that environment?
it definitely had its challenges, especially being an international woman. And yeah, I mean, because you're looked at from a different perspective, especially because you're an international. And if you are with other women, for example, they expect you to even sit a certain way, or because women had certain gender roles, so they'd be like, oh, why don't you come carry water with us, like the jerry can on your head, and these kind
Mm-hmm.
of things. So yeah, there was a lot of challenges, and most of the time, actually, if I had to negotiate, like with governors, and most of the time governors and chiefs and community leaders are male positions.
Mm-hmm.
So always negotiating in these conversations, it's always really good to think about the gender balance,
Mm-hmm.
especially because if I was the team leader in this situation, I would probably have one of my male teammates with me, especially older male, depending on. So I always had to think about these aspects. Like I could never go into a negotiation for access situation by myself. Like I always had to think about these different dynamics.
Mm-hmm. So Eli, tell me about situations in which you've operated, maybe something specific relative, I mean, thinking in terms of what Heather was sharing with us.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of unexpected things that happen on the streets when you're part of a political demonstration and there's a counter protest. So, a lot of the tactics that we teach are both about trying to humanize, but also sometimes to just kind of create a distraction. So this is an example that does a little bit of both. This was at the March for Life demonstration in DC. There's a counter protest that happens at the Supreme Court. And this older white man who was escalating the tension and raised his voice like far higher than anybody around him. And he was, really focusing on a person who was a counter protester and yelling about the greatness of America and the killing of babies. And, this led to another counter protester putting their sign in front of his face and trying to put a camera, on him. And so this stuff was starting to kind of intensify. And physical contact was kind of starting to happen. So one of us, we had a couple of people there, and we just kind of made our way over there. And one of us kind of got up close to the man that was yelling and just said, "Hey, those glasses look really good on you. Where did you get those?" And he's looking back and forth. It's kind of broke the intensity for the moment. And then one of us was like, "Oh, can you tell me more about what is great about America, and tell me what's that mean to you?" And he started to do this a little bit, and then his partner who was with him, who was sort of egging him on, kind of supporting him in this, was like, oh, don't worry about him. He'll calm down. He'll be fine. And so one of us engaged with her, and that was able to kind of defuse their energy and get their attention away from really kind of attacking, potentially harming.
So you find that kind of that's a way of derailing the situation. I mean, this is something you train for. In other words, you train people want to do this work. So here's what you do. This is how you derail something, or I don't know. Just is that what you're doing? Or
yeah, we usually call it distraction. I mean, we're trying to shift the energy of the situation.
Okay.
So it's less dehumanizing. We don't try to stop conflict. Like, we're very clear that there's constructive conflict. Right. People can be angry, be upset about injustice. So we're not there for that. But when it looks like it's about to get destructive conflict or dehumanization or direct violence, we'll try to get their attention, whether it's through conversation or distraction, or even just with our bodies, kind of between people, or kind of kneeling down, or kind of walking people back.
What I'm going to ask Heather the same question. I'm going to ask it specifically for her. But when somebody comes to you and say, "Dr. McCarthy, I'd like to do this work. I'm really interested in this work. I'd like to be in that space." What are you looking for in the types of people that come to you and want to do this kind of work?
Was that for me or for Heather?
Yeah, for you, yeah. And then I'll ask Heather the same question. I'll ask it specifically about her, but I'm asking you. Somebody comes to you and says, "I want to do this kind of work, Dr. McCarthy." What are you looking for in the person? I mean, doesn't suit for everybody, I would imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's accessible to many people who, have an experience of empathy, an experience of being cared for or caring about others. I mean, I think those are the seeds to kind of do this work. I mean, usually somebody comes to us, we would be grateful, and we would kind of check in with what's motivating them, like, why are they drawn to this? Have they had other experiences? What are you interested in from what you see on our website or kind of heard about us? And then we would try to connect those interests with kind of where our needs are,
right,
and the needs in the community.
But one of the things that I think about is that I remember, and we've all seen the videos of how nonviolent training was done, lunch counter training. We know we've seen this reenacted on television. Notwithstanding what's going, you've got to sit there, right? Kind of a thing. That kind of fortitude, right? That's probably really important, and that's important in humanitarian work, being able to stand the ground without creating a violent altercation, right?
Yeah, we definitely, I mean, that's certainly part of our training, and we look for people who can who can be centered and can kind of be patient and not like reactive and
Right.
defensive. That is really a key thing. And also like folks who, you know, aren't like overly suspicious about certain groups or certain groups, because that can, you know, that can impact the way they act in the field, particularly at a political demonstration. And it also impacts like who they might share information with. That, you know, we're not about, for example, like turning people over to the police, like if we're at a political demonstration, like that's a role, for instance.
Heather, tell us, thinking about yourself, what are the things that you best offer to this work in your own character and your aptitudes and abilities, and thinking about how much that might have connected to your humanitarian training experiences?
Well, I think that it's really important to be adaptable to a lot of situations, especially if you're working in other cultures. It might seem really obvious, but I've had teammates who have not been able to adapt, and their time was very difficult because they were unable to adapt to either the culture or, you know, things change very rapidly in the field. So you have to be ready to change your plan. You know, like you can make a plan, but you know, you're fine by the seat of your pants. So yeah, to be adaptable. And also I think having an experience like the Forage Center helped me prepare, because it gave me an idea of what it could be like, you know. That was my first experience of what it could be like in the humanitarian field. So I think having this experience, and people could have this opportunity to have that experience, because I think there were some people who joined and they were like, this is not for me. And some people were like, yes, I want to do this. So definitely that Forage Center experience helped me sort of realize that, yeah, this is the work that I want to be doing.
Do you remember anything in particular, any situation within the simulation that you were involved when you were working with us, that you think, aha, that situation? Because, you know, we had simulations where people at times were dressed in military, they were government officials, army officials, they were provocative against the humanitarian workers. The humanitarian workers had to hold their ground. Anything that comes to mind?
Well, yeah, all of that actually, because, you know, it's because so much happens in those 4 days that you're there, but all of those activities could happen within a 6-month period, you know. So in a way you have more time to prepare, and maybe in a real life situation, whereas there you're like, okay, let's do this, let's try to negotiate with this military guy. But that definitely happens. I mean, you're definitely, you know, military people try to intimidate you. Government officials will try to intimidate you, exactly how it happened in the simulation. The teamwork is really important, and this also showed in the simulation. You know, trying to build up this rapport within your team first really kind of helps how you and your team are going to respond in the field. Because if you don't have this rapport with your team, then it's going to be really difficult to be effective and also have a quality program in your work. So
So I'm going to go, I've got a question here for Eli. So I'm going to ask that, if I can, start pulling some questions out of the text box. And I'm just going to read it. Can Eli speak to how local law enforcement has responded to their presence as civilian protection? I ask because I wonder if they are responded to as supportive of the protesters rather than a neutral body. And do they work throughout this year with different law enforcement agencies to inform them of their role in these protests? And I can repeat those questions, but Eli, can you take some of that? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's really kind of an emerging edge of this work, is how to navigate that relationship well. You know, one of the things we do is we try to inform the community members about who we are in different ways. The police are part of the community, and we've we've let them know kind of what our role is in certain demonstrations. So at the March for Life, for example, they'll stand like in a straight line between the protesters. They won't usually say anything. They'll kind of stand up strong and, you know, have their guns out.
Mm-hmm.
And our role is very different. Like, we are engaging people and having conversation and, you know, trying to prevent things from escalating rather than kind of waiting for that moment where something breaks out.
Mm-hmm.
You have to sort of pull people. So we try to let them know who we are and what our role is. You know, our hope is that they, as they get exposed to this, that they start imagining, you know, more unarmed kind of practices. You know,
Right.
countries in the world that have primarily unarmed policing.
Yeah.
So that's going to take some steps, but, you know, we're in this moment of like reimagining community protection, largely
Right.
lives matter. So there's really a lot of opportunities for this, and we're trying to do what we can in DC and other places to kind of move that.
So I'm going to it kind of begs the question, that is, law enforcement is the model. Do you imagine the model for law enforcement changing? I mean, we have, you know, arguing that, well, we got to defund the police or reform the police, right? And wherever that lands, changes are going to come from it. Is the police taking this approach one of the changes that you could imagine?
Yeah, I think the police model has to change. Like, there's just no doubt about it. There's way too much harm that's happening, particularly to minority communities. And we've got to respond, particularly people who have access and privilege.
Mm-hmm.
We have to respond. You know, and I think a big piece of it, as Black Lives Matter has said well, is kind of moving the money and investing in some of these communities where there's some more struggle and less access. But I think it's also about equipping community members with these skills
Mm-hmm.
on violence and bystander intervention, restorative circles, protection. And as we get those skills and we practice it and we pilot these deploying of teams to different neighborhood events, you know, situations of challenge, then it becomes a lot more familiar and
Right.
more real. And then, you know, the community starts protecting itself more and more.
Yeah.
And the police either, you know, start doing other things or less things,
Yeah.
something really different in the process.
What do you think, Heather, and what you're seeing? I mean, can you imagine, as someone who engages in this, I mean, could you imagine yourself having a career in law enforcement? And I mean, taking these skills, I mean, I imagine, could we be training law enforcement in this? Could you do that?
Well, to be honest, I would love to train law enforcement. If that was an option, and if we could do that, like get in some way, no matter the city, like I would love to train law enforcement in unarmed civilian protection. Unfortunately, I feel like especially law enforcement is really far off from that. I mean, a lot of, you know, there are these different groups of people that are starting. Since I've been in the US, I've learned that there's different groups of people popping up looking for these creative solutions to resolving conflict.
Right.
So that's why I think it's great that the DC Peace Team, you know, the DC Peace Team is there to support these initiatives. But yeah, I mean, I would love to involve, because I think, you know, it's working at grassroots level. I mean, you can work with everyone, you know, like if you can work with law enforcement, if you can work with the medical enforcement, with, yeah, I mean, just different groups of people. I think this nonviolent training could benefit a lot of people. So yeah, I mean, I don't think I could be a police officer, but if I did work in law enforcement, it would be to hopefully be able to train.
Well, that's kind of the reform issue, right? In other words, if you argue for reform, you have to reform by bringing in these ideas. I mean, one of the things that I would ask Eli is that this work that you're doing, I mean, Eli and I are in this world where show me the data, show me the results, show me that this works kind of thing. Is that out there, Eli? In other words, are we able to say, convince me, not anecdotally, show me something?
Yeah, it's a great question. There is data out there, and it's certainly growing and needs to grow. I mean, I think the group that has the best data right now is Cure Violence.
Okay.
They have a public health approach to violence, and they're working to kind of interrupt the transmission. So they actually have a couple neighborhoods in DC where they deployed people, and they have a lot of great stats and research. Like their average is, they focus on shootings and homicides.
Mm-hmm.
So in the neighborhoods they work, those things are reduced 40 to 70%.
Wow.
And they had a program in Honduras where it was like an 88% reduction. The Nonviolent Peace Force also has a lot of great sort of evaluations and metrics that they have on their website, and they presented to the United Nations and UN agencies, and the US government actually funds Nonviolent Peace Force in South Sudan. So they got a pretty good amount of metrics. DC Peace Team, we have a section on our website that says event report. So it has some of the anecdotes, it has a little bit of quantitative stuff. But we've got a small team of measurement evaluation folks that are actually starting to track even more these last few months. So we're hoping that will grow.
So thank you, Eli. I'm looking for more questions. I don't see any more questions. Fortunately, I have my own questions, but this is really the time to start kind of putting in your questions, if you can, for Eli and Heather. So, one of the, and maybe you touched on this already, Eli, one of the things that I think about is kind of the ethical dilemma that civilian protection people come into. Like, in other words, you see people really doing bad things, but your role is just to do this, right, and just kind of stay in that space, right? But this other thing that's going on really repels you, but you've got to stay in that space. Is that a challenge for people who work in this sometime?
Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Well, like if you're so what I saw in Portland was organically these mothers were getting up and they were forming, right? And so they're creating a buffer between the police and protesters. But they can't engage in a violent way, an obstructive way with the police, though they might want to. They might want to really, or even react to the protesters in that way. So they have to kind of hold back that, right? So maybe it's not so much ethical as only they're dealing with their conscience, that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly situations when we're at events where there's things people are saying or doing that we might personally disagree with, or we don't think is the right strategy to get your objective,
right?
So that's when we're on the spot there, like those are the kind of things that in terms of strategy that we would try to address beforehand, just in one-on-one relationships. But when we're on the spot in the demonstration, we're trying to prevent people from like directly being harmed and dehumanization when we can. Actually, we're invited to these events by organizers.
Who would invite you? Yeah, who would invite you to come? I mean, you wouldn't just show up. Would a community group invite you? Would officials invite you? Or maybe you would just show up. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, it really depends on the context. So I'll give you an example. Like the Unite the Right rally happened here in DC a couple years ago, and it was a racial justice, a huge, much more counter protesters than sort of official demonstration.
Right.
And, that occurred when we started going to some local organizing meetings and finding out who was helping to organize.
Right.
We knew some of the people from other relationships, and they formed like a security team, and we said, can we be part of that team? And they plan out the strategy and so forth. So then we deploy based on like where they want us to be. And, if they're going to do civil disobedience, they let us know. We're not there to like stop their civil disobedience.
Right.
Resistance strategy.
Right.
Other events like the March for Life is a little more lower key. It's not as big of a power differential,
Mm-hmm.
the two groups. So we've kind of been going there traditionally for the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
We introduce ourselves when we're there to the people there, and we say, if you need help, you can, wave
Mm-hmm.
or that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, Heather, what's been your experience? I know you're now doing some work in the U.S., and I know you've been coordinated. You and Eli are working together a little bit.
Mhm.
In the situations you've been in, without being as detailed as you feel you can be, are you being invited in? Is it something that somebody is seeking for somebody to come in?
Yeah, usually, I mean, it's you're
Okay, you froze there.
depending on who invites you, you have to. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. You have to really look at your biases beforehand, and really focus on, like, okay, I'm here for protection and for nonviolence, and just think about it in that way. And yeah, because if you're going to demonstrations, you're not going to be holding up protest signs with whoever you're with, right?
Right.
You're there for if something were to happen, or to help be proactive in this sense of
Yeah.
reducing violence. So
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to pull out some questions if I can from the chat box. There's a question. Eli, you shared about working in China, and actually we have some students on the line who are from China. Can you share a little bit more about the work in China?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It was actually a former student of mine at Georgetown who was from China, and she went back and she was working on a summer camp for youth. And she, learned about the DC Peace Team, and she invited us over to do a number of trainings for the summer camp. So we did things on nonviolent communication and bystander intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So we had one of our teammates was there for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks running.
Right. Are you doing any work in Hong Kong?
Not presently, no.
Yeah. But I mean, that seems like a place where there's been a lot going on, right? That seems like a space where this type of work might be valuable.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Heather, I want to ask you about getting involved. So one of the questions I have is, do you have any advice for young people? And I'm going to make you a young person. I know you're still a young person who aspire to this. Tell us a little bit about kind of how you came from. I mean, I'm talking. You were at community college. You really came a journey, right, to where you are. Tell me a little bit about that. What would you give as advice?
I would say it's definitely challenging, but if you just keep trying and try to get different types of experience wherever you can. For me, I mean, as you said, I came from a community college background, and then from there, university, and then my bachelor's, and then I got my master's, and then from there I was like, okay, I really want to work internationally. So what I did was I just left to Lebanon. Maybe, I don't know if I would recommend just leaving with nothing, but for me it kind of worked out because I was able to really start building relationships with people and talking with local organizations and seeing what it was that they needed.
Yeah.
And also you can do that online. Like if you know of a certain organization that you're like, oh, that's really cool, I like what they do, I want to learn more. You can either do informational interviews with someone, or volunteer work, or trainings.
I have to ask you this question because we've known each other a long time. You had to do some convincing at home too, right? I mean, going to South Sudan is not a place that your family, wait a minute, what are you doing?
Convincing friends, family. I mean, it was pretty difficult because, I mean, especially, South Sudan, because whenever I first went, there was an active war going on. So, at the time when I went, it was named the second worst country for humanitarians, as far as safety goes.
Oh man.
Yeah. So I had to do a lot of explaining and a lot of different discussions, and really break it down into a way, I guess, that other people could understand who didn't study the work, or because I mean, I studied it, I read a lot about it, and And, you know, just trying to, because people know about the Red Cross or they know about Doctors Without Borders. So talking about it in this way and trying to bring it, you know, down to a certain level, so that people can understand like why you're going out there to help. Or
Yeah.
but even then, you know, you'll still probably get resistance from family and friends.
Yeah, it's a lot of educating, and I think one of the challenges, those of us who work in the space, is that it's sometimes it's a challenge to get people to recognize what's going on in other parts of the world and how important that work is, even making the connection between how that work can affect us here. Today we have our own challenges, of course, so maybe it's easier to make the argument for what's going on in the United States here. Unfortunately, we have a lot of need for this. I'm going to go back to the chat box. We have about 10 minutes to go, and I want to kind of get the chat box questions out, and I'm just going to put them out. Either one of you can answer them, Eli or Heather. So one question I have is, how do you get your voice heard if you are part of a marginalized community? And I guess this is kind of a general question, but how do you, and maybe this is broader than just civilian protection. So either one of you, how do you get your voice heard?
Well, I can say something about that because whenever I was working in South Sudan, I worked with youth because this is one reason why I really like to work with youth in general, because I feel like youth are one of the most marginalized part of the community, and they want to make a difference. They want to be heard. So yeah, I was working with a lot of youth in South Sudan, and this was something that they were asking. So what we did is I mean, part of our work also was creating these groups of youth, and so they could come together and they all had the same interest. They're like, oh, I didn't know you were also interested in this. So
Yeah.
they're able to come together to share, and they have these amazing ideas that I would have never thought of.
Mm,
Like, okay, you know, how can I support you in these ideas? So I think if you come together, if you have other people who have similar ideas as you, then you can talk about it, figure out how you can get your ideas out there, figure
yeah.
out who do you need to talk to, like who do you need to start building relationships with. So it's not always like, you know, protesting or trying to see who you can give a speech to, but it's also about building relationships, and you can start with that too.
Yeah, and before I go to Eli, that's really speaks to something that we really think is important in the field, that the solution answers come from within the group themselves. That is, those of us who are outsiders, right, coming in, whoever we are, DC Peace Team going to Portland or Heather Payne going to South Sudan, it's the community itself that has the answers, is that our role is help them facilitate that answer,
Yeah.
but we don't add any more in a sense. I mean, Eli, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. That's one of our main kind of principles, is the primacy of local actors, and you know, both in terms of kind of receiving invitations, but also kind of trying to help create space for the local actor and the local, you know, grievances to be heard, to have more space to operate. You know, just on the question about getting the voice heard, I think
Yeah.
there was kind of pointing to this about, you know, building coalitions is really crucial, like coalitions between different groups
Yeah.
of similar interests. And then also identifying credible messengers, like who are the people that have credibility in the community and that have credibility with the decision makers that you're trying to influence. And, you know, it's okay to build relationships with those folks and try to leverage that in your work. It's always good to think of a strategy, right? Don't just like react to something or get angry and then just throw yourself out there. Like, we do want to express our anger and like challenge injustice, but we also want to be strategic and like.
I mean, what you're suggesting is there's a lot of planning involved in it. It's just not a matter of showing up on the front line. Mm-hmm. It's mapping what's going on. It's building those alliances. Is putting that. I mean, this is what I always think is really interesting, is that strategic nonviolent action or civilian protection is as complex and as much planning as any military operation. Is that sometimes we say, well, you know, the military has to plan this, that, and the other thing, and these nonviolent actors, they just show up. And I say, no, that's not what happens, right? There's a lot that goes into this, right? I mean, both of you can speak to that. Heather?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of planning. I mean, yeah, you can't just show up to a place and be like, okay, we're here, how can we help? You know,
Right.
like that's not how it works. And we have to really kind of think about, I don't want to say use the same tactics as military, but you have to think of these analysis, and you do have to think about safety and security almost in the same sense that the military does. Like, okay, if we go to this area, what is our safety going to be like? If like a certain thing happens to us, like what are we going to do, if we're in this
Right.
situation? So yeah.
Eli, tell us about planning and all that.
Yeah, we definitely do a lot of strategy in terms of like mapping out where the potential risk spots will be,
Mm-hmm.
trying to identify, who to put in our different groups and like
Mm-hmm.
the persons that are going to be around in terms of their credibility with
Mm-hmm.
those types of groups. We have communication strategies, whether it be walkie-talkies or like a line of communication. We have emergency response forms and what to do if something.
Yeah.
And it's really about collaborating with other actors who are leading the strategic nonviolent movement. Like we do
Mm-hmm.
protection work, and we're trying to support these strategic nonviolent movements. One of the things I saw in the chat, somebody was asking if there's other peace teams. And
Yeah, please. Anything you want to answer? Yeah.
There's actually a network. It's called the Shanti Sena Network.
Okay.
I put it in the chat box. I'm not sure if that goes to everybody, but
yeah, it does.
It's SHANTI
Mm-hmm.
ENA, and it's a network of U.S. teams, but also Canadian teams.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's like the water protectors in Dakota that we're trying to protect from the pipeline. They were doing protection.
Mm-hmm.
Presbyterian Peace Fellowship and down on the border is trying to protect migrants and immigrants. Mm-hmm. And then you have peace teams in Detroit and Portland, and here in DC, Nonviolent Peace Force is operating out of Minneapolis. So there's a lot of great options, and we really love to have more people kind of experiment and imagine and create this in different communities.
So I guess that's my next question is, because we're kind of at the end, how do somebody's on this call and they're saying, I want to get involved in this. Maybe I want to talk to Heather more. Maybe I want to find out about DC Peace Team. What's kind of the next step for somebody who's interested in this work?
Yeah, I can go. So, we have a website, dcpeaceteam.com, where you can kind of get a feel for the different programs and what's happening. And then you can contact us. My email is esm52@georgetown.edu. And basically we'll just kind of, talk about your interest, and, we've got a variety of ways to get involved. Like, you don't need to be on the front line sort of risking your life or risking arrest or anything. Like, there's people that do social media, there's people that do outreach, there's people that do measurement evaluation, people that work on grants. We had one undergrad this summer, a family peace education workbook, exercises for families to do with kids of a bunch of different ages. So we're open to like new projects that you might want to explore that's kind of related to our work. There's definitely a lot of ways to get involved.
And that's really important to remind people, is that your operation is just not people on the front line. There are people who are planning it out, who are supporting it. I mean, one of the questions that somebody raised was the danger element, and certainly in a certain area there's an issue of security, but if that's not your cup of tea, there are other things that you can do to support the activities of people who are working on this, right? Heather, what would you suggest?
You mean for people to contact me?
Yeah, or what's the first step for somebody? I know you and Eli are working together. You're going to say, call Eli and get involved in DC Peace Team, but what else would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot about different organizations that, since I've been here, just that I didn't know about in the U.S. So, whether you're in the U.S. or you're in another country, there's probably some organizations, no matter how small, they probably exist. So it's about finding them and trying to connect with them somehow, saying, hey, I have these ideas, and I find that it's amazing that you also have the same values and principles as me. And I'm just trying to get involved in any way. And you'd be surprised how one thing leads to the next.
Mm-hmm.
especially in this work, because everyone in this, that I've met in this work is like, oh, there's this going on, and then, oh, there's this going on, and then before you know it, you have a bunch of different things going on. So yeah, reaching out to people. I mean, even attending talks like this, and attending different. Now there's so many different online trainings. Of course, the DCP team does a lot of online trainings, and then there's a lot of different presentations and trainings from other organizations as well. So it's about finding those and getting involved that way.
If you could also put in contact information, that would be great. Eli just did it. Make sure it goes to everybody. If people want to reach out to you. And Eli, did you give us the website for DCP's teams so that people want to get to it directly? You might want to put that in there also, so that people who are interested. So
Yeah.
we are closing in on 5 o'clock. I know that there were some more questions, and what I would say is that if there is a question that we just didn't get to, go ahead and reach out to Eli and Heather directly. So do that. I want to, first of all, thank Eli and Heather for carving out some time for us. This has been an issue that we've talked a lot about in the Forge Center, about the connection between what we do and where people go with it. Students who come into our programs end up in different spaces, and some of them end up in Peace Corps, and some of them end up in NGOs. But when Heather ended up with Nonviolent Peace Force in South Sudan, it was like, that's not what we had expected. And here she's created this pathway for anybody who comes into our program. And now that she's back in the US working with Eli, looking at this need there is a present need in the United States for this kind of work, particularly in the next couple of months. So I'm thankful for both Eli and Heather spending some time with us this afternoon. And I also want to thank St. Cloud State University and Amy Kalmus for spending an hour with us also. This was really a good first step for us to incorporate an interpreter in our programs, and this is something that we'll certainly try to do again. This will be available on our website so that you can go back and revisit it if you wish, and see it again or share it with anybody. We are looking to have another program in about a month, and you know what? I forgot the name of the program. I apologize. So if anybody who's on our virtual education team and remember the name of the next program, let me know. I think it's going to be like the 28th or the 29th of October. So those of you who are already here, if you can go back to our website, we'll post that pretty soon. We're trying to do these once a month. This is actually our September program, but it's October 1st. So we're going to try to do another program in September. Keep this. Oh yeah, we just posted Christy McGuire, Developing Cultural Competencies for Conscious Humanitarian Work. So we're going to be talking about that and bringing some experts there. Eli and Heather, did you want to say anything before we close it out?
Yeah, just thank you so much. We thank you for those who are interested in this work. We do have some trainings coming up this Saturday.
Please.
And the 17th is bystander intervention. There's really a lot of activity around the post-election scenarios. So if you want to come in and try to be helpful for that, we'd be happy to have your participation.
Thank you, Eli. Heather, anything you want to end with?
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and for your questions and your interest in this work, and I really hope that we can all do this work together. We're all in it together, so thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for those attending. This is David Smith from the Forge Center. I wish you a good afternoon, and we will look forward to seeing you again later in the month. Thank you very much.